Alright, Master Gardener newbies. This is Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener, Part 4. So we have various different types of plants. Some are woody. They have woody tissue in their structure that gives them a lot of rigidity. Others are herbaceous and lack woody tissue, and first frost here in Florida, they turn into a pile of mush. And then we have different plant types. Some are annual, some are biennial, and some are perennial. Now in Florida, with our unique climate and conditions, some annuals can work like a perennial, kind of like patient Lucy's that we've been talking about in this class so far. You all know and have been growing patient Lucy's for many years, right? And you love them. Oh, you still haven't figured out what patient Lucy's are? Oh, you like to use a scientific genus apparently instead of a common name. You like to call them impatiens. Impatiens is a scientific genus for the impatiens that we typically grow in shady locations in Central Florida. So, patient Lucy's, or impatiens, how can a plant be patient and impatient at the same time? Haven't figured that one out quite yet. But again, they can sometimes act like a perennial until we get a killing frost that terminates their existence for a while. Then we have biennials. Usually up north that takes two seasons of one of vegetative growth and a chill down before they'll flower. But some of our biennials will do their thing in one season. A good example is parsley here. If you plant parsley in the fall, it loves the cooler weather of fall in Florida. You can grow it easily throughout the winter. Also, as a butterfly attracting plant, this is where swallowtails will lay their eggs. So a lot of butterfly enthusiasts will plant parsley for that very reason alone. And then comes spring, after it has had a chill and then a warm up, it'll flower and then that plant will die. It's completed its life cycle. Then we have plants that are perennial, or at least we hope they're perennial. Now, some people have a hard time with some of these plants, and they'll bring these perennials, quote, quote, from the north. Hosta is a good example of people bringing a plant from the north, planted here, and quite frankly, it's going to work like an annual down in Florida because it's not adapted to our conditions down here. So, growth factors that we deal with all the time in our environment and the plants, what they have to deal with. Water. During the rainy season, they may get too much. That's why cactus don't do too very well in Florida. You don't see a lot of cacti and succulents. That's more for California, in Southern California. Light. We get a lot of sunlight during the summer months. In the winter, it's kind of low, and it's a little bit more difficult and challenging to grow a vegetable garden in the winter months when it's the time to do so, with the lower light and shorter days. Temperature. We get all sorts of temperature extremes in Central Florida, but we pretty much can bank from about the end of May into about the end of September. Most days are going to be in the 90s. Conversely, we get to somewhere around Thanksgiving and Christmas, and a lot of times we'll get a frosty night or two, or we may be lucky and not get it till January, or some rare cases February. But almost always this county will have a frosty night or two every year, and we sometimes get hit with hard freezes. That limits us growing some of those beautiful tropical plants. We're fortunate to be on the peninsula. Our air quality is fairly good most of the time. Other parts of the country may have issues with ozone, for example, which can cause issues with plants. Pests. Of course, we live in a subtropical climate. We moved here for a reason, to escape the cold. But as a result, our climate can support insects pretty much any day of the year. And we get new pests introduced to the state of Florida all the time that we'll have to contend with as gardeners maybe at some point. Then there's the culture of the plant. A lot of people don't understand the culture of the plants that we grow here. Good example are our various turf grasses. They do not behave quite the same way as the northern grasses, the cool season grasses. We're growing warm season grasses, which grow by and large during the summer months and go semi-dormant or quiescent in the winter months. And people want them to grow 365. That's not possible. So, growth factors that are genetic. not environmental. You have the family of plants, grass, cucumbers, palms, whatever. Then you have a species of plants. Sometimes we have different species of plants that have northern cousins. Then we have varieties that occur naturally, as we've talked about already in this class. And then we have cultivars, or cultivated varieties. Good example of some of these things are the cultivars that we have selected for southern conditions, like blueberries. We grow blueberries here in Pasco County. We have several U-Pick and other blueberry farms, and yes, they do very well. But there are certain cultivars that have been developed, mostly by the University of Florida, for a low chill. Usually we only get about 200 or so chill hours. We'll talk more about that in fruit crop section, but the point is, you go to a big chain box store, they may be selling blueberries, but they're not the cultivars for our unique low chill climate. Then we have something from the seed source. We will call it ecotypes. A good example are our native wildflowers. A lot of those will also grow in Texas, and a lot of the seed is sourced out of Texas. Now, how can the same genus and species be different in Texas versus Florida? Well, by and large, Texas is a drier state versus Florida. So their seeds, even though it's the same genus and species, are designed to do better with less water. We bring those ecotype seeds from Texas into the high moisture of Florida, and they don't thrive quite as well. Another example would be red maple. They grow up and down the East Coast and grows into Canada. But if you take a seed from Canada and try to bring it here, it probably won't get its chill hours met and would eventually succumb to the lack of dormancy, which is required in that particular plant species. Other factors that influence growth are the urban factors, how we prune it, or in some cases what people call pruning. I'm doing air quotes here. I call butchery. Staking. When you stake a plant really rigid, it becomes weaker over the course of time. That natural wiggling back and forth makes it stronger. I like to equate that to astronauts in space. Those that are on the space station for a long period of time lose muscle mass and have a harder time when they first come back to Earth with the gravity and the resistance against the bones and muscles and ligatures and all that, ligaments, etc. Then there's spacing. For some unknown reason to me, there seems to be an unwritten rule that we can't plant any shrubs or foundation plants any further than 3 feet away from the house. And from there, we can't space them any more than 3 feet apart from one another. This usually causes problems down the line in the future. Think about our plants when we first put them in. They came from a nursery. That should tell us right there that they're baby plants. But people want that kind of that instant look on these new developments and don't want to wait 2 or 3 or 4 years for them to kind of gradually fill in and be at the right spacing. Soil compaction. Now, sand is hard to compact, but you add a bunch of other stuff to it, or you scrape away sand and put in some poor quality fill, it can compact very well. Engineers like homes to be built on compacted soils. Plants don't like to be in compacted soils. You can see where there's a problem in the urban environment in some of these developments. The soil can be so hard that air and water just can't really penetrate very well. Now, I did mention that we live on the peninsula and our air quality is good, but in some parts of the country, pollution issues can be a problem with plants. Light. Now, I mentioned we generally have a lot of sunlight here in Florida, but some plants want to be in the shade. Conversely, others want to be in full sun. People understand that grass, when we get to this part of the program, needs about 5 to 6 hours of sun in order to grow, especially our warm season grasses. And sometimes the conditions in the urban environment change over the course of time. That oak tree that was planted 12 years ago, or 15 or 20, no longer allows enough light to penetrate through the canopy down to the turf that was planted around it at the time. Then there's nutrition. Typically, our sandy soils are devoid of many key nutrients except for phosphorus. Again, we can supplement that, but we can also over-supplement nutrition, which we'll talk about when we get to fertilization. Here's a really interesting formula I learned many years ago as an undergraduate in college, and I think it's very important to keep this always in the back of your mind as a master gardener trainee, or for that matter, a seasoned master gardener. You have the genotype, the genes of the plant. That tells it what it's going to be, whether it's an apple tree, corn, a palm, whatever. Then you have the environment that that plant is placed in, and that will equal what you see. Good example is when people say, why does my plant not look like my neighbor's? Well, let's say it's a certain kind of shrub. Let's say it's gardenia. Well, if you place a gardenia in the wrong pH of soil, you're going to see some problems of yellow leaves and maybe not really good blooming. Where the neighbor put it in an area of the yard that has the right soil pH. So, the genes of the plant are one thing. The environment dictates kind of what's going to happen to it, and it equals what you see. We call that phenotype. I like to use bonsai as a good example. Doesn't matter what species of trees these really are, but let's look at the diagram on the left. It looks like some kind of a maple to me. I think it is. So why is that maple tree only about 2 or 3 feet tall or less? Again, the maple tree should grow into a 30, 40, 50, maybe 60, 70-foot tree, but it's only, a couple of feet tall. So the genetics of that tree are telling it grow big and tall. But the environment that it's been placed in this case a very small shallow pot, are preventing it from becoming to that full potential of its genetics. Do you see where we can have problems with how we care for plants, and what we do in the environment can equal what we see, and why we sometimes have problems in certain landscapes? Good example is we try to grow a jacaranda tree inland in Pasco County. Beautiful purple flowering tree. It's tropical. Get a frosty night, it's dead. Yep, it's not a plant that is programmed to survive our climate. So, again, I pretty much mentioned this, but it's really important. The genes tell the plant to become a large tree. The environments are high. The environment for the roots is highly restricted. Think about that in urban environments. Can that happen? Absolutely. We grow a lot of plants in containers. You take it out of the container and the roots are kind of spinning around. Most people won't break up that root ball properly, but they'll just take it out of the container, place it in the ground, put some soil back on it, water it a few times, turn their back, and wonder why in 5 or 10 years that tree has hardly grown any. The roots are still highly restricted. They're still turning round and round and round in the soil, kind of like a corkscrew. It'll eventually choke off the tree. It could also be a parking lot island. An oak tree placed in a parking lot island will never become a 100-foot oak tree if it's a live oak or whatever. So the phenotype of those plants that are in restrictive spaces equal a small size version of the full size tree. This is the meaning of life. C6H12 plus C6 or CO2 plus H2O equals C6H12O6 plus O2 given off. In other words, carbon dioxide, what we exhale, a waste gas to us, animals, plus water in the presence of light will give us simple sugar, C6H12O6, that's a sugar, and then the plant gives off oxygen as a result of that reaction. The oxygen is something we need in order to grow and survive. We're interdependent with plants, and plants are interdependent with us. At night, they reverse this process and they consume sugar and a bit of oxygen, but again, there's always a net gain in oxygen with plants around. Stomates, this is the pores or the little breathing apparatus in the leaves, primarily found on the underside of the leaves. These pores can open and close. They have what is called guard cells, and you can see in the upper picture that it's fairly closed. Plants will close those up during certain portions of the day or at night. depending on the plant species. Good example are cactus. During the day, they have their stomates tightly closed. Wow, they need to get in CO2 in order to do their thing in photosynthesis, but they have them closed during the day when there's sunlight. Why do you think a cactus would do that? That's right, it's a way to conserve moisture. So it opens them up at night. Meanwhile, it's storing carbon dioxide in a very complex molecule that it'll use during the daylight. That's why cactus don't grow very fast, because there's a limit to how much CO2 they can put in this specific acid that they have inside their tissues. But most plants will have them open during the day, during photosynthesis hours. But again, if the plant starts to wilt, let's say your patient Lucy's are kind of wilted, those will close back up to conserve moisture. Again, they're usually found on the underside of the leaves of most plants. The idea is that the humidity, relative humidity, is a little higher on the underside of the leaves than on the top side of the leaf that's exposed to the sunlight. If you've ever noticed plants that have fuzzy leaves underneath, kind of like our magnolias, those hairs trap some of the moisture from the pores of the stomates and keep the humidity a little higher. It's an adaptation to drought. Now, some plants won't have them on the underside of the leaves. A water lily is a good example. If they had stomates or breathing pores on the underside of the leaves and it's floating on the surface of the water, it would simply couldn't get the CO2 it needs into the plant. So it has it on the top side. So plants have all sorts of adaptations depending on where they are. Plants have hormones and they know how to use them. And we as gardeners know how to manipulate them for the good, and a lot of people don't realize for the bad what they've been doing with some of their practices on their plants. Now there are all sorts of hormones in the plants: auxin, cytokinin, ethylene, gibberellin, abscisic acid, and ethylene, which isn't on this slide yet. The point is they do different things, but they don't do just one thing. A good example is to use a human analogy here. Guys, we have primarily what hormone in our system? That's correct. We have a lot of testosterone, but we also produce a small amount of estrogen. That's why, guys, when you go to a chick flick, you get a little teary-eyed. Now you know. Now, women, by comparison, have more estrogen in relation to a small amount of testosterone that they also produce. So it's sometimes a relative proportion of one to the other that dictates what happens in the plant. Auxin. You are going, I've never heard of it. What does it do? Apical dominance. We'll talk about that in a minute. Gravitropism. Gravity doing things. Phototropism, the turning toward light primarily. Vascular differentiation. It inhibits abscission or leaf loss. Stimulates ethylene synthesis, another plant hormone, ethylene being the only one that's a gas. Inhibits or promotes flowering in some plants. It can stimulate fruit development in parthenogenic or parthenocarpic fruits. That's a fancy way of saying virgin fruits. They produce without fertilization. Seedless grapes come to mind. Also induces roots on cuttings. So if you've ever used a rooting compound, it is a form of auxin, usually synthetic in nature. Cytokinins, apical dominance, shoot growth, and fruit development. Ethylene, oh, it is there. Fruit ripening. If you've ever had an avocado and you're ready to have a Cinco de Mayo party and they're still kind of on the green side, you tuck them in a paper bag with an apple, and that will help speed up the ripening process, the bag capturing or keeping the ethylene gas in place. It also causes leaf and flower senescence, or leaves and flowers to start dying. And this is a problem in like cut flower production. You cut the plant off, the flowers off the plant, it releases ethylene, and that causes cut flowers to start the dying process. Abscission, which is a controlled loss of leaves. Gibberellins, you probably don't know about them unless you are maybe a camellia enthusiast. Flower stimulation in long day plants. Some plants will only flower when the days are very long, in the summer months. Usually they're from the northern parts of the planet in their native environment. Causes shoot elongation. Abscisic acid helps open and close those stomates or stomatal closures. Abscission. Abscission is a process of plants to lose leaves. Good example of when you know a plant is in trouble. Think about back to frosty weather or winter and you have something like hibiscus. If the plant freezes, what happens to the leaves? They usually look like cooked spinach at first, and then a couple of days later they're brown and holding on to the plant. If plants can, they will send out abscisic acid and control and in a controlled manner shed leaves. But when the tissue freezes, that hormone can't be moved from one point of production in the plant to the area where it's going to fall off the plant naturally. That's a good indicator of a rapid decline in the plant, whether it's due to cold or insects or diseases or something else. It also sends plants into dormancy. Some people will use various forms of this on some of our low chill fruit cultivars like blueberries to get them into a better dormant state for better production, flowering, and fruiting. So, I mentioned auxin is used in inducing roots, and there are various brands of artificial auxin. Root tone is just one of the classic ones that you can use, and you may have used. What you do when making a cutting, you have the nodes and internodes, and you are telling the plant by increasing the amount of auxin at the base to produce adventitious roots, as I talked about earlier in this series. If you've ever noticed grapes on old paintings from the 1900s and before, you notice that grapes look mostly like the cluster on the right. All kind of like the shape of Italy is how I kind of think about it. But you go to most grocery stores and buy grapes and they're more like on the left, this more open habit. These plants were sprayed with gibberellic acid, a plant hormone. Usually it's synthetic in its origin, it may not be. But the bunch of grapes on the left was sprayed with the hormone. Notice what has happened. The grapes are larger because gibberellic acid causes cells to elongate. So bigger cells, bigger fruit, weighs more, you get more money by the pound. Also notice the cluster of grapes is more open. This reduces insects and disease issues on grapes, which are notoriously plagued with lots of insects and diseases. So the one on the right, which hasn't been sprayed, the grapes are smaller, they're tighter in the cluster, and a lot of insects and disease issues ensue because of that. Gibberellic acid, if you are a camellia enthusiast, they are used to promote earlier flowering. When I worked at Bok Tower Gardens in Lake Wales, I would start about the Labor Day holiday. I would break out the leaf bud that you can see in the lower left-hand picture. I would break that out and I put a small drop of diluted gibberellic acid there. That would cause that big flower bud to swell and start blooming about 3 months sooner. So we would get flowering of our Japanese camellias, Camellia japonica, starting around Halloween. And I would do this about once a week for about 3 to 4 months. It also made the flowers about 20 to 30% larger. So if you ever go to a camellia show, you'll see camellias that are in bloom that have been jibbed, as they get called, and non-jibbed. They're just judged differently because of the hormone causing this cells to be larger or elongate. It wouldn't be fair to compare jibbed ones versus non-jibbed for judging if flower size were one of the requirements in the judging process. Cytokinin, we won't go into a lot of detail, but it does cause cell division, can cause wound sealing and formation of corky tissue. This is the plant's response to pruning cuts. When done right, plants will seal the area. It stimulates the formation of callus. That's kind of that ring around a good pruning cut. Decreases plant aging and stimulates use of nutrients. Can promote lateral bud development and dicots. promotes chloroplast development. That's what produces the energy in the plant cell through photosynthesis. I mentioned ethylene. It promotes the aging of plants and plant parts. Think about the grocery store and the floral department. We have, generally speaking, the flowers right next to all that produce giving off ethylene gas. That's why usually grocery store flowers don't last as long as a florist shop who doesn't store fruits and vegetables in their coolers. Even if the flower area is away from the fruit and vegetable of the grocery store, think of where they're stored before they make it to the showroom or out into the grocery store. They're stored probably in the same refrigerators. When I worked with a rose grower as an college undergrad, we were not allowed to put our lunches in the nice and cold chill units that we chilled our roses. So we would make sure to get as much longevity out of those cut flowers as possible. It can promote flowering in certain plants. A classic example are the Bromeliaceae, the bromeliads. A good example of a bromeliad family member is the pineapple. You may have heard of putting an apple or covering a pineapple with a plastic bag and then putting an apple in there for a couple of days. The apple will release ethylene and cause or promote the flowering. Heck, you can use a rotting banana peel just as well. Abscisic acid inhibits cell formation and growth. It causes the formation of the abscission layer. This is how plants up north that lose their leaves and plants down here do their thing in a controlled process. At some point, the plant realizes the days are getting shorter and cooler. It produces more abscisic acid. The layer where the leaf is going to fall off forms, and then the leaf naturally falls off at that point of attachment to the stem. It's a very controlled process. I already mentioned this, so I won't go into great details, but again, the pineapple is a good example of where we sometimes will employ ethylene. In fields where they grow pineapples, they'll spray a form of ethylene right into the little cup. Think about why that would be an advantage as a pineapple grower. If you can harvest the crop all at once, rather than one here, one there, one here, one there, you save on labor costs and you know about what day you're going to have your crop to market, so you can time it. So it's very advantageous. Here are those patient Lucy's in the middle, the orange flowers, and they did not get exposed to ethylene gas. But here's what happened with as little as 2 parts per million, that's 2 ppm, of ethylene for whatever reason. Maybe they were all jammed together and damaged in the transport process in the truck. They start losing the flowers, and in some cases they'll start losing the leaves. That's going to conclude part 4 of Botany and Taxonomy for the Master Gardener. We're going to wrap it up in part 5. Join me soon.